The 2024 trade deadline is officially over, and now we can look at every single NHL team to see what they did during trade deadline season, to see which teams had major success and which teams didn't do what they should have. We're going to be going through every single NHL team and grading them from F all the way to A+. So how did your team do at this year's deadline? What grades do I give them? And what grades do I give the entire NHL this year? Make sure you watch till the end for every single one of them. And of course, hit that subscribe button for more hockey and trading more content just like this all throughout the year. Now, how this is going to work is that we're going to count every single trade since the Chris Tanev deal on February 28th. So it's not just deadline deal days, it's the entire trade season to see how your team did. Now, we're going to go through every single team here. Let's start out with the Central Division, though. A division, and really the Western Conference in general, just loaded up at this year's deadline season. And especially in the Central, there were a lot of teams that got a lot better. Now, one team that didn't get a lot better was the Arizona Coyotes. Starting with them, they made 3 different trades during this deadline season. They got a 4th round pick for Troy Stecher and a 7th. They got a 6th rounder for Jason Zucker, and they got a 5th rounder for a 7th and Matt Dumba. To me, this is what Arizona needed to do. They didn't have a lot of assets that they needed to trade, but they had a few rentals that they might as well have gotten rid of. Zucker was an obvious one. Dumba was an obvious one. Stecher was an obvious one. They all got dealt, and for decent packages. I especially think the Stecher deal was pretty great for them, and overall, I thought it was a pretty solid one. Nothing incredible, but I'm going to give them a B-. Not a bad deadline for them, but they didn't really add anything for the future or anything for next year that could help them. Next up, we go into the Chicago Blackhawks, and they really only made one trade during trade deadline season, and that was getting a 5th round pick for Anthony Beauvillier. I think, honestly, decent value for them, considering they gave up a 5th round pick, and Beauvillier just was not working out in Chicago. It was a fine deal. I'm going to give them a C+, but I think Tyler Johnson was a pretty obvious guy they could have traded that they didn't, and they probably should have. Now we're going to get into some more teams here in the Central Division. I first wanted to talk about Sleeper Fantasy, though, and share my Sleeper picks for tonight. If you don't know, if you go in the description and click on the link, sign up to Sleeper Fantasy and deposit using promo code GRAB, you can start with Sleeper to use your hockey knowledge and turn that into real payday. And also, today is the final day you guys can win this Chris Chelios signed jersey. All you guys need to do to enter the giveaway is to deposit on Sleeper using my code. And we got 3 different picks here tonight, 3 sneaky ones. First, I got Nathan MacKinnon, more than 0.5 goals. He continues to be on fire, has at least a goal in each of his last 5 games. And of course, it's at home versus Minnesota, so he's going to get a point at least. I also got Jaden Schwartz, less than 0.5 points versus Winnipeg. I think he's gotten less than a point in 12 of his last 14 games. And then Stankoven, more than 0.5 points. He's been a monster since he's been called up, and he's going to continue to be versus Anaheim. And last time on the channel, we put $10 down for 5 different players and won $52. Not a bad haul there. To make your own daily NHL picks and to win big, join Sleeper Fantasy today. And thank you so much to Sleeper for sponsoring today's video. And of course, make sure you get in on the Chris Chelios giveaway before it's too late. Next up, we go to the Colorado Avalanche, who had one of the most active deadlines out of anyone, and one of the best deadlines out of anyone. They started out by getting rid of Curtis McDermott for a 7th and an AHLer. Then they got Sean Walker and a 5th round pick to get Ryan Johansson off the team, and giving up a 1st round pick in the process. Walker is a huge addition, and also Johansson with some of the locker room troubles there is huge to get rid of. You also get Casey Mittelstadt for Bowen Byram, finally fixing their second line center issues. They get Brandon Duhaime and Yakov Trenin for some great depth, and giving up a 5th rounder for Ben Myers. To me, with Colorado, it was close to perfect. If they got a goalie, I would have given them an A+, but they were just missing that. I think a Capo Kakinen would have been perfect and still wouldn't have cost that much. I'm going to give Colorado a straight A. Still, though, a lot of issues that were solved. Speaking of issues being solved, we go into the Dallas Stars, who made the big landmark trade in Chris Tanev, and really it's the big one. They gave up Grushnikov, a 2nd rounder, and a 3rd rounder, and a 4th rounder on top of it, but Chris Tanev is exactly what the Dallas Stars needed on the defense. Now, I maybe would have liked to see a goalie backup upgrade. Wedgwood has had a lot of work thrown his way, and he hasn't been too good, and Ottinger has really been struggling lately, but still, Tanev, I think, was the main thing to add, the main piece to add, and they went out and got it. I'm going to give them a straight B for it. Next up, we go into the Minnesota Wild, who had a kind of interesting trade deadline, I guess. They got rid of Brandon Duhaime and got a 3rd round pick for, which I think is pretty decent value. They also got rid of Patrick Maroon and got a 6th rounder. It's nothing that is absolutely incredible or anything, but I think for Minnesota, it was okay. I feel like they maybe could have gone in a more retooling direction and maybe been a little bit more aggressive in selling, but still, it's not the end of the world. For me, I'm going to give them a B-. Next up, we go to the Nashville Predators, who had about as good of a deadline as I thought they could have. They're a team that I didn't think needs to improve in massive ways, but I think they did. They first got rid of Yakov Trenin, got a 3rd rounder and Jeremy Hansel in the process, who could be at NHL someday. They also got Anthony Beauvillier, and we'll see how he fits. Obviously, he has a lot of experience with Barry Trotz at the Islanders as well. They got Jason Zucker for a 6th round pick. That's house money you might as well do that. And they got Wade Allison for Dennis Gurianov. I think an upgrade for their NHL roster. And I think for the Preds, with how they're playing, with how well they're playing, again, they didn't need to do anything crazy. And I think for the value they brought in and brought out, I thought it was pretty good. I'm going to give the Preds an A-. Honestly, one of the better deadlines out there that we've seen so far. We go on from one of the best deadlines to one of the most iffy in the St. Louis Blues because they've got rid of Malcolm Subban for future considerations. Not really much to say there. St. Louis is kind of in a weird realm right now where they're still trying to compete, but they're also still trying to trade Pavel Buchnevich and trying to get rid of all these guys, yet they didn't get rid of anybody, so I guess they're still trying to go for it this year. They're kind of in this weird middle area where they're just not good enough to actually compete, and they didn't really do anything to change that. I think for St. Louis, this could have been a trade deadline to really focus on the future. They had an opportunity, and I think they missed on it. I'm going to give them a D-. Now we go into the Winnipeg Jets, who I don't really count Sean Monahan in this video, but I think it is instrumental to what Winnipeg did. Still, though, their deadline addition was Tyler Toffoli, coming out of nowhere, and they only had to get rid of a second and a third round pick, and that second rounder isn't even for this year, which is huge for the Winnipeg Jets. I mean, to me, this was a no-brainer move to make. You saw so many teams in the Central loading up, and Winnipeg adds Monahan and Toffoli, two guys that will help them in the playoffs a ton. And Toffoli as well, I'm a big fan of offensively. I think it's going to be really interesting in Winnipeg's system, and for that package, it's a no-brainer. I think Winnipeg did fantastically here, and I'm going to give them an A+. Now we move on to the Anaheim Ducks, who were also incredibly busy at this deadline, being involved in a couple of three-team trades. First, they got a third-round pick in the Ilya Lyubushkin deal, and I think that's pretty good value for him. And in the Henrique and Carrick deal, got a first-rounder and a fifth-round pick as well from the Edmonton Oilers. And then we go on to the couple of trades they made after the fact, getting on Mysak for Perreault and Ben Myers for a fifth-rounder. But to me, just the complete value, getting a third-rounder for Lyubushkin, getting a first and a fifth for Henrique and Carrick, getting a Jan Mysak who could be interesting. I think for Anaheim, they did pretty well here and got some pretty great value for some of their veterans, and I'm going to give them a straight A. They did pretty well here. Now we move on to the Calgary Flames, who were one of the most active teams in general over the past year, as they should be, getting rid of Elias Lindholm and all these different things. Nikita Zadorov earlier in the year, and then, of course, Chris Tanev, that major deal there, getting Grushnikov a second and a third-round pick, which I think is pretty good value for them. And then you got the Noah Hanifin deal, where they got Miromanov, who can play on the NHL roster now, a first and a third-round pick, and then you got the Riley Damani deal, and at the buzzer here, the Nikita Ahadiuk deal, which I think is honestly pretty interesting for them. They kind of reload that defense a little bit, and I think for Calgary, even though you might have wanted to see a little bit more in the Hanifin deal, perhaps, I still think they did pretty good offloading a lot of their major assets, and now the hard work comes in rebuilding this group. Still, though, I'm going to give Calgary A-. I thought they did very well with a lot of these trades. Now we move on to the Edmonton Oilers, who were an interesting one because they went out and immediately got a massive deal done, landing Adam Henrique and Sam Carrick, two guys that I think will be excellent depth for the Oilers and exactly what they needed. And they went out and got Troy Stecher as well for some more defensive depth there too. And I don't really find those deals bad at all. I thought for them, it's exactly what they needed. But I would have preferred another move. I would have preferred maybe a upgrade on the defense on that top six, a solidified guy that you could get, that you could trade away a Cody Ceci for and make the salary cap work. I know that Edmonton had cap troubles, and a lot of that was why we saw a three-team trade with the Adam Henrique deal, but I feel like Edmonton could have just gotten a little bit more of a defensive upgrade and it would have been perfect. Still, though, I'm going to give Edmonton a straight B because I think the moves they made were pretty good. Now we move on to the LA Kings, and do you see the problem here? Well, the Kings didn't make any trades at this year's deadline, and there was reports that they were going after Linus Ullmark, that deal didn't go through. If they pulled off an Ullmark deal, to me, that would have been exactly what LA needed. Unfortunately, nothing has come up, and I do have to give them an F. I'm sorry. Now we go into a team that was much more active at the deadline this year, right at the end of the deadline, and we don't even have the trades of Tomas Hertl and also Vitek Vanacek on this. It just shows how crazy the Sharks deadline day was. They first got to traded Duclair in a seventh for Jack Thompson in a third. Thompson, who's done really well with Syracuse in the AHL this year. I really like that deal for them. They also get Klim Kostin in exchange. They give away Radek Simek and a 2024 7th. I think that's honestly a wash. Then they get a 5th rounder for Nikita Ahadiuk. It's fine in that way. And you get a 7. You get Devin Cooley for a 7th. You also trade Kaapo Kähkönen for Vitek Vanacek, which could be interesting there. And then of course you got the humongous Thomas Hertl deal, where they got a 1st, they got David Edstrom, they got a couple of 3rd rounders for salary retention. A wild deal there that I'm not even sure what to make of at this point. I think San Jose did pretty well here though, getting the amount of assets they got back for the future, and I'm gonna give them a B+. Now we go into the Kraken, who really didn't do that much this year. They really just traded Alex Wennberg to the New York Rangers, got a 2nd and a 4th round pick back, which I think is pretty good value. I think there might have been a little bit of a missed opportunity to trade out some of that older players on the team to get maybe a little bit more stocked up for the future. A player like Justin Schultz comes to mind as a player who was a rental, who didn't get dealt, but still, what they got back in the Wennberg deal was pretty great value, and I'm going to give them a C+. Now on to the Vancouver Canucks, and it's hard to talk about their trade deadline because they didn't really do anything of note at all. They didn't trade anybody, and of course with the Chris Tanev February 28th cutoff, they've only traded for Elias Lindholm, and of course before that Nikita Zadorov. I think it's fine. I'd rather you trade for players ahead of time so they get more adjusted to the system and the roster, but I do feel like with the West loading up around them, it was a little bit disappointing to see Vancouver not do anything. We heard a conversation of them going for a 3-team trade involving Lindholm, but obviously that didn't end up happening. I'm just going to give Vancouver a straight C and leave it at that. Going on to the Vegas Golden Knights, again, it's so complex that cap friendly doesn't even have the Tomas Hertl deal, but what they gave up, I still think was fine considering what Hertl can be, and the salary retention there is massive. You also got Noah Hanifin, who could be signing long-term somehow, and you get Anthony Mantha for pretty good value there too. Vegas was stockpiling picks and prospects, and they offloaded so much of it at this year's deadline, as they probably should have. They've looked at their team recently, they haven't been good enough, and these trades could really push them forward. It's hard not to give Vegas an A+, considering what they brought in for what they gave up. It's a no-brainer, honestly. Going on to the Carolina Hurricanes and going on to the Metro Division, we start out with them, who had a actually pretty good deadline. I like what they did. They were a 13 broker in the Ilya Lyubushkin trade, getting an extra 6th-round pick. They gave up a 6th-round pick to Kay Weber, a guy they weren't going to sign. And they got, of course, Jay Guentzel and Ty Smith in a landmark deal, and they didn't have to give up crazy amount. They didn't give up any of their top prospects, a Jackson Blake, a Bradley Nadeau, an Alexander Nikishin, a Scott Morrow. None of those guys were involved. And they get Jay Guentzel, a superstar they've needed. Somebody else with offensive talent on that roster is exactly what I've been begging Carolina to acquire, and they finally did it. And then again, they got to get Evgeny Kuznetsov, who could be really interesting in Carolina's system on a new team in a new situation. We'll see how he performs, but that's an offensive player that can play on offense and can really show some skill. And for Carolina, they get him and Guentzel, and if they both work out, that could be fascinating. I'm going to give Carolina a pretty good grade here. I thought they did well, and I'm going to give them a straight A for it. Going on to what the Blue Jackets did, there wasn't really much at this year's deadline. They got Malcolm Subban likely for the AHL, and then they got rid of Andrew Peake's contract, got Zaboral and a 2027 3rd rounder. I honestly really like that Peake deal for them, considering the negative value that his contract had, and considering they didn't even retain any salary. I'm going to give Columbus a B-. It wasn't crazy or anything, but they did pretty well. And you also got the Jack Roslovic deal, which for some reason isn't showing up here, but it was fine. He was a rental, wasn't going to get much. You might as well deal him. Then we go into the New Jersey Devils, who have had a weird week. They first got Curtis McDermott, then they traded Tyler Toffoli for just a 2nd and a 3rd, and then they got Jake Allen for a 3rd rounder, potentially even a 2nd. And to me, I thought it was pretty bad. But then out of nowhere, they traded Vitek Vanacek in a 7th for Kaapo Kähkönen, and I actually really like that deal. Kähkönen next to Allen could be exactly what New Jersey needs in their goaltending tandem. Likely won't be the issues, these things that pushes them in the playoffs this year, but I think for next year, it could provide a lot more stability there, which I think is what matters at this point. I'm going to give New Jersey a straight B. It started out pretty bad, but it did get better. Now we go on to the New York Islanders, and these deals shouldn't even be counting because they're both in 2023. Of course, Lou Lamoriello slept at the wheel. That was pretty much an automatic bet at this point. Now on to the New York Rangers, and again, I'm not sure why the Roslovic deal isn't showing up here, but they got Roslovic for a 4th rounder. They also got Chad Ruhwedel for a 4th rounder and Alexander Wennberg for a 2nd and a 4th. I like this deadline for the Rangers. I don't think it's what's going to push them over the top compared to other Eastern teams like the Panthers or the Carolina Hurricanes. But they did get better. I like the depth acquisition in Ruhwedel, and Wennberg will be good as the 3rd line center. But I feel like they really could have gone for Buchnevich and put themselves over the top As for right now, I'm going to give them a B-. It wasn't offensive or anything. They filled some holes. It was all right. Now we go into the Philadelphia Flyers, who had themselves a busy week. First, trading Sean Walker and getting a first-round pick in exchange. I think great value there. They were also a third team in the Noah Hanifin deal, getting an extra fifth-round pick. Plus, they got Erik Johnson for some leadership for a fourth-rounder. A little bit expensive for me, but it's whatever. And they traded Wade Allison for Denis Gurianov. Really, the big one to me is the Sean Walker deal. Getting a first-round pick for that is pretty incredible value. For Philly, I'm going to give them a straight B. That deal is really the cream of the crop, though, of this entire week. Now on to the Pittsburgh Penguins, who had a rough week, an absolutely brutal one, having to get rid of their superstar Jake Guentzel, and it's definitely unfortunate. The value, I mean, I've seen a lot of people going back and forth on. I think it is okay, especially considering the lack of prospect depth in their pool. I think Ponomarev, Lucius, and Koivunen will all be NHLers in the future, and Bunting is decent. He's solid, and who knows if that second rounder becomes a first. They also got a fourth round pick for Weedle, which is fine. And overall, that's pretty much the sentiment I have for the deadline. It was fine. It was okay, but it really just sucks it's had to come to this point. C- for C plus for Pittsburgh. It was okay, but nothing too special. Now, one of the Washington Capitals, who made quite a few different moves. They first got rid of Anthony Mantha for a second and a fourth. They also got rid of Joel Edmundson for pretty much a slight upgrade on what they traded him for, a third and a fifth. And then they got a third-round pick out of the Kuznetsov contract, which to me is actually pretty good for them. We've heard for so long how Kuznetsov needs to be dealt, and we heard some rumors about buyout potentially coming for him, but they were able to get rid of him just to retain some salary. I think Washington did pretty well. There were other options they could have traded for, like Nick Dowd and also Max Pacioretty, that they didn't end up dealing, but still, I thought it was pretty okay for them. I'm going to give them a B-. Now we move on to the Atlantic Division and the Boston Bruins, who acquired Andrew Peeke and Patrick Maroon. Adding some physicality onto the roster is never a bad thing. Now, for the Bruins, it was reported again there might have been a Linus Ullmark deal, and that might have involved purely Dubois, and Ullmark nixed it, basically saving the Boston Bruins franchise. I mean, I know they need centermen, but Dubois is just not that guy. And Boston would have been in a weird spot without Ullmark. The chemistry of him and Swayman would have been gone. It would have been disastrous for me. I think Boston, overall, though, was okay, and I'm going to give them a C+. Now on to the Buffalo Sabres, who made a couple of moves on deadline day. Of course, they had the earlier deal, getting Bowen Byram for Casey Mittelstadt, which in his first game with the Sabres, looking pretty good there, so that's good to see. They got a seventh rounder for Kyle Okposo, which is fine. They got a fourth rounder for Erik Johnson, which I actually think is pretty good value. Overall for Buffalo, besides the Byram Mittelstadt trade, there wasn't anything too exciting, but I think they did a good enough job. I'm going to give them a B- here. Now on to the Detroit Red Wings, and the Radek Semek deal was the only trade they made, and I'm a little bit disappointed by that. I still think they, just like Edmonton, maybe could have gone for a defensive upgrade on that group over a Petrie or Armada, maybe trade Mata for an upgrade there, but they just got more depth on the defense, which I think is fine. I don't think they needed to make any trade, but I feel like it really could have bolstered their defense, and it really could have made their playoff aspirations a lot better. I'm going to give Detroit a D-. D+. You know what? I'll give Steve Yzerman some respect here. Now we go to the Florida Panthers, who, after the Vladimir Tarasenko deal, it was looking like they were going to go after, make a ton of big trades. That didn't end up happening. But they got Tarasenko for a fourth and a third, which is incredible value there. They got Kyle Okposo for a seventh, just some forward-checking defensive depth in the bottom six, which is fine. But Tarasenko really is the belle of the ball there, and I think it was a pretty great trade. I give Florida an A-. I still think they maybe could have done more, but we're splitting hairs at that point. Now we move on to the Montreal Canadiens, who made quite a few moves really over the past few months. Obviously, the big one was Sean Monahan in February, but since then they got Jacob Perreault for Jan Mysak, which I do think they come out on top of, and they also get a third rounder, potentially a second, for Jake Allen. I don't think they need to make a ton of other moves. Maybe a Yoel Armia would have been another trade to make, but I don't think there was a lot of guys with pristine value, and some guys could wait till the offseason, like Jordan Harris as an example. I think they did pretty well there. If they get a second for Jake Allen, that's incredible. I give a straight B to Montreal. Now we move on to the Ottawa Senators, who really just have the unfortunate Vladimir Tarasenko trade to look at, and I know the context. The no-move clause sucks, but still, man, getting a third and a fourth for Tarasenko still sucks in the end, and there was no other moves either. I'm going to give Ottawa a straight C. It was okay. Now we move on to Tampa Bay. Oh, Tampa Bay. This, what a team to talk about here at the deadline. To me, there is maybe so few other teams that are as disappointing as Tampa Bay's trade deadline. They were a third team in the Adam Henrique deal, getting an extra fourth round pick, which I think is smart for them. They also got Anthony Duclair, and even though I think it was a little bit strong value to give up to San Jose, I think he could be good in a solid speedy role in the forward group. But to me, they needed to add to the defense. They need to go out and get a major upgrade, and they got Matt Dumba, who is pretty good physically, can hit pretty well, but he is not an upgrade, in my opinion, on a lot of Tampa's D, and that's saying something. Tampa's defense was a obvious need. Noah Hanifin would have been a huge one for me, but it seems like they lost out on him, they lost out on Chicken Room, they lost out on everybody, and Dumba as the consolation prize sucks. I'm sorry to say it. I'm going to give Tampa a straight D. And then we go into the last team we're going to talk about today in the Toronto Maple Leafs. And one of my bold predictions was that we wouldn't see them make any major trades, and that came true. They got Ilya Lyubushkin and Joel Edmundson, two players that I don't think are going to be offensive whatsoever. Edmundson especially will be very good at getting away with cross-checks in the playoffs, and I think his game elevates in the playoffs as well. So I think there is something to be said about that. But there wasn't any major acquisitions. I think they could have gone for a better D, a true top 4 D, but that didn't end up happening. I think it was okay. I'm going to give Toronto a C-. They'll get away with it here. But those are my trade grades for all NHL teams at the deadline this year. I want to know in the comments down below, what do you guys agree with? What do you guys disagree with? And who do you guys see as the winners, the losers of the deadline? Let us know all your thoughts down below. And how did your team do at the deadline this year too? Of course, share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online and get the video out there and click on this card for all my trade content right in one playlist. My name is Nathan, and I hope you have a great hockey deadline day, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.